how HIV/AIDS got its name with the origins of the stigma and religious language. On September 24, 1982, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention officially named the condition AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Over a year after the initial cases emerged, early discussions around AIDS were rife with confusion about its causes and transmission, significantly influencing societal perceptions and stigma surrounding the disease. The term AIDS was pivotal in how societal viewed the epidemic. While conservative Christian figures like Reverend Jerry Falwell branded it as, quote, God's punishment for sexual immorality, activists pushed for terminology that emphasized humanity. They advocated for, quote, people living with HIV, end quote, rather than AIDS victims, highlighting their dignity and existence beyond illness. Historian Jennifer Brier notes that the disease's early association with the LGBTQ community was crucial, although scientists later established that HIV circulated among various groups before 1981. Early media labeled it as, quote, gay cancer or, quote, gay pneumonia, end quote. The CDC's adoption of the term AIDS aimed to encompass all affected groups, including heterosexuals. But the stigma against the LGBTQ community lingered. During the 1980s, the Christian right viewed AIDS through a moral lens, equating with a decline of societal values. This perception often dominated public health discussions, impacting policy. President Reagan's administration faced tension between conservative advisors advocating abstinence and Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, who promoted comprehensive sex education and prevention strategies. Many queer and feminist religions leaders emerged, actively working to dismantle stigma and advocating for justice among marginalized populations. Today, AIDS is viewed through a broader lens, with a better understanding of its scientific aspect and social implications. I have a lot of comments, so let me get my glasses. I'm ready to read. LGBTQ still remains the highest stigmatized, against HIV and AIDS. And obviously we talk more about HIV today than we do AIDS, because back in the 80s, AIDS diagnosis, even back then, if people are living today and they were diagnosed with AIDS, today they still have that label, even if they're undetectable.
Yeah.
So even though they were labeled an AIDS patient at one point, they are still labeled that today. But do they get the benefits of the people that went on disability that were diagnosed with AIDS? No, they do not, because they can be undetectable. So laws need to change and reflect to that. Also, another term that was also coined, which wasn't, I went and researched the story, was GRID. I don't know if some of you are familiar with GRID, which is called gay-related immune deficiency. And that was coined before AIDS was used. So, obviously there's a lot of stigma surrounding the LGBTQ community, but the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic by the 90s was the sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
Yes, not New York, not San Francisco,
and they
not the United States.
A lot of them were straight people getting
it.
Yeah.
So.
But for whatever reason, I guess our community got hit hard here in America. So it was the gay disease. Right. I remember sitting at the table. I was in high school, eating dinner. My father had the evening news on. It was either Walter Cronkite or Peter Jennings. And it came up, the story came up, and I almost choked because they were talking about this mysterious disease that was affecting gay men. And by then I knew that I was gay. I hadn't connected that I was trans yet, but I knew I was gay. And by the morning time, I had every freaking symptom. It's crazy what we can do to ourselves because, but it was labeled that for the longest. And I remember going to funerals. The families would dare not put HIV/AIDS. You died of cancer. You died of something else. It was so stigmatized. I remember going to see my friend Ronald Eric Allen in the hospital, and it was like 1987, and they had them like quarantined, and like just the attitudes of the nurses, because at that time people didn't know. We really didn't have much information on it. So the healthcare people were scared. And you could feel the energy. It was like almost like they were leopards, And we've come a long way, thank God.
Thank God.
But yeah, our community took a big hit. And I'm going to dare to say this. I think two people changed that. When Magic Johnson got announced that he was HIV positive, I think it was a reality check for straight America. You have this macho basketball player coming out and saying, I have AIDS, I'm HIV positive. That was a big eye opener because for a long time, straight people was like, "Oh, that has nothing to do with me."
There are still straight people today who don't.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I don't get. That's a gay disease. I can't get that.
Yeah.
And the other one, I gotta mention him, Ryan White, because people. They can have compassion for children, and I think a lot of the country, they overlooked their biases, and they just had compassion for this little boy that was dying from it.
Right.
So I think those two really were like game changers. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting you had mentioned Africa. When AIDS or HIV first came out, I was here, but then I moved back to Zimbabwe to live with my dad. This was early 80s. And it was interesting to see how the stigma here translated to Africa.
Wow.
It was, again, thought of as taboo, a gay thing, but it was affecting straight communities, women and children, particularly in Africa at that time. It was an interesting process to go through, coming from here, going there, and then coming back again and seeing how things were so different in two different countries.
Yeah.
You know? But the one thing that was the same, there was no empathy. People were dying.
Right.
Yeah.
People were
Yeah.
sick. And even today, there's really not
You
much
know why-
There's not much empathy.
You know why there's not much empathy, and especially back then, because it hit our community.
Right.
And they didn't care. That was the reality of it. Oh, those gay folks, it's their punishment. That's what they deserve.
Oh, they did
you
it
know?
to themselves.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
they don't,
yeah.
They don't
I mean,
understand
I think
it.
even some of the hate aimed at Dr. Fauci was after COVID was really around, they kept lauding him for being this leader for, the HIV and AIDS research. And,
That's true.
and a lot of that, again, aligned him with our community.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting. I did just rewatch for I think the third time, because I think it's so good, is the Rock Hudson documentary.
Yeah.
And, it's so interesting to hear, like, even, we think of Hollywood as being so liberal, that when he, was in a, kissing scene with Linda Evans, that she said people didn't want to film with her in Hollywood. So, I mean, but, we've come a long way, but I agree. There is still a lot of ignorance. A lot of ignorance.
And when we look at I've reported this before, we look at a worldwide population, more than 50% of the people living with HIV are women.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
Yeah.
Do your research.